When the Hawker Typhoon reached RAF squadrons in September 1941, it carried Britain's desperate expectations. The Air Ministry needed a fighter that could intercept the Luftwaffe's new Focke-Wulf 190, an intimidating German aircraft that had been humiliating Spitfire Mark Vs across the Channel since its combat debut that summer. Sidney Cam's team at Hawker designed the Typhoon around the massive Napier Sabre engine, a 24-cylinder powerhouse generating over 2,000 horsepower. On paper, it promised 400 miles per hour at altitude and enough firepower to dominate European airspace. Reality was different. The Typhoon became a death trap that nearly destroyed its own squadrons before shooting down a single German plane. Within weeks, pilots reported catastrophic malfunctions. The Sabre overheated chronically, sometimes seizing without warning in combat. Connecting rods fractured, punched through cylinder blocks, and sprayed superheated oil across cockpit canopies. Worse, the entire rear fuselage had a terrifying habit of separating in flight. Structural breakups occurred in high-speed dives when elevator loads exceeded design limits. Between September 1941 and May 1942, dozens of Typhoons simply came apart, sending pilots to their deaths with no chance of escape. Squadron leader Dennis Crowley Milling witnessed 2 of his pilots die this way within a fortnight, their aircraft disintegrating during routine training flights over Lincolnshire. Carbon monoxide was just as deadly, only quieter. Exhaust fumes leaked into cockpits through gaps in the engine cowling, poisoning pilots on longer sorties. Men returned from patrols with severe headaches, nausea, and blurred vision, symptoms first blamed on fatigue or altitude. Several pilots blacked out at the controls. Flight Lieutenant Roland Beaumont nearly died in November 1941 when carbon monoxide left him barely conscious at 15,000 feet. Only his wingman's desperate coaching kept him flying long enough to avoid a fatal stall. Medics eventually identified the source, but fixing it demanded comprehensive modifications that Hawker's overstretched factories struggled to complete while keeping production lines running. By early 1942, confidence in Typhoon squadrons had collapsed. Pilots nicknamed the aircraft the Murderer and requested transfers to Spitfire units. Air Chief Marshal Sholto Douglas seriously considered cancelling the entire program. Britain had already spent millions of pounds and thousands of engineering hours on an aircraft killing more British airmen than Germans. The procurement fiasco threatened Fighter Command's modernization, just as German air superiority endangered Britain's ability to project force over occupied Europe. Only the lack of alternatives kept the Typhoon in service. Britain's other advanced fighter, the Westland Whirlwind, had already failed due to engine troubles. Cancelling the Typhoon would leave the RAF without a response to the Focke-Wulf 190 for at least another year. Roland Beaumont, now commanding 609 Squadron, became the Typhoon's fiercest defender, despite knowing its flaws. He argued the basic airframe was sound. The engine and structural defects were solvable engineering problems, not fatal design sins. Beaumont flew dozens of test sorties, logging failures and proposing fixes. His reports went straight to Air Vice Marshal Trafford Lee Mallory, who reluctantly authorized one last improvement push. The Typhoon earned a temporary reprieve, barely. No one yet realized this troubled interceptor's real purpose wasn't up at 25,000 feet, but down in the flak-filled air just above the ground. Hawker's engineers worked through the winter of 1941 to 42 under immense pressure, knowing that every unfixed defect pushed the Typhoon closer to cancellation. The tail failure crisis took priority. Structural analysis showed the joint between fuselage and tail lacked reinforcement to cope with massive aerodynamic loads in high-speed maneuvers. Engineers added 12 fishplate brackets to spread stress and stiffened the entire rear section with heavier gauge aluminum stringers. Production aircraft were retrofitted. Whole squadrons were grounded for weeks while teams installed the kits. The RAF sacrificed operational capacity it could scarcely spare. But the fix worked. After March 1942, tail separations dropped to nearly zero. The Sabre engine proved far more stubborn. Napier had rushed the power plant into service without adequate testing, and the consequences surfaced everywhere at once. Sleeve valves, innovative replacements for poppet valves, expanded unevenly when hot, causing seizures that wrecked cylinder blocks. Napier's chief engineer, Ernest Chatterton, tightened manufacturing tolerances and introduced higher temperature lubricants. The changes reduced seizure rates, but didn't eliminate them. Pilots adapted, limit sustained full throttle, and watch cylinder head temperatures like hawks in combat. Carbon monoxide infiltration needed simpler but equally vital remedies. Hawker redesigned cowling panels, adding rubber seals around every opening where exhaust could creep in. The cockpit gained stronger ventilation to maintain positive pressure, pushing any leaked fumes out rather than letting them pool around the pilot. Crews fitted chemical CO indicators that changed color at dangerous levels, warning pilots before symptoms struck. Less dramatic than tail reinforcements, perhaps, but these measures saved lives and rebuilt trust that the Typhoon wouldn't silently poison its own. Through 1942, Typhoon squadrons stayed on the line, despite rolling modifications, flying defensive patrols along Britain's south coast. As a high-altitude interceptor, however, it still failed. Above 20,000 feet, the Sabre lost power, and the Typhoon's thick wing created drag that crippled climb. Focke-Wulfs could simply out-zoom and dive away before Typhoon pilots could bring guns to bear. Squadron leader Dennis Gillam of 615. Squadron voiced the frustration. They had the fastest fighter at low level, and almost no use for it where the Luftwaffe actually operated. The revelation came almost by accident during anti-shipping strikes in summer 1942. Several squadrons tried low-level attacks against German coastal convoys. The Typhoon's 4 20mm Hispano cannons were devastating against merchantmen and escorts. Below 2,000 feet, where the Sabre breathed freely and the thick wing made a rock-steady gun platform, the Typhoon was suddenly lethal. Pilots learned to skim in at wave-top height, hammer ships with concentrated bursts that shredded superstructures, then accelerate away faster than any pursuing Messerschmitt could follow. These rhubarb strikes, opportunity attacks on targets of chance, proved the Typhoon excelled precisely where few expected it to fly. By November 1942, the worst technical crises had passed. Structural failures were engineered out. Engine reliability had improved to acceptable, and pilots no longer feared CO every time they strapped in. The Typhoon still wasn't a high-altitude fighter, but a different role was emerging, one that would turn Britain's most troubled aircraft into Germany's nightmare on the ground. The Air Ministry's reluctant acceptance that the Typhoon would never master the thin air came in early 1943, reinforced by trials at Farnborough against a captured Focke-Wulf 190. Above 18,000 feet, the German outclimbed, outturned, and outgunned the Typhoon. That lovely stable, low-level wing became parasitic drag up high. Meanwhile, the Sabre's supercharger struggled in thin air. Fighter command needed the Typhoon elsewhere, and circumstances obliged. German tip-and-run fighter-bomber raids over southern England intensified through late 1942. Focke-Wulf 190s with 500-pound bombs blasted in at sea-skim height, hit coastal towns, and fled. Radar couldn't see below roughly 500 feet, and conventional interceptors lacked the sea-level speed to catch raiders already accelerating home. Here, the Typhoon's phenomenal straight-line speed at the deck was decisive. At about 2,000 feet, a Typhoon could hold roughly 380 miles an hour, enough to run down the raiders on egress. 609 Squadron pioneered the method in January 1943, flying standing patrols on likely routes. Roland Beaumont scored the unit's first low-level kill on January 20th, catching a lone 195 miles off Selsey Bill and closing to 200 yards before a 3-second burst sent it into the channel. Within weeks, other squadrons copied the playbook: forward base near the coast, scramble on radar cue, intercept on the withdrawal leg. The Jabos discovered they were no longer safe down low, and by March the attacks were fewer. At the same time, Fighter Command expanded the Typhoon's offensive scope with Ranger sweeps across occupied France, armed recce's for locomotives, trucks, barges, and troop columns. The Typhoon's cannon were brutal against soft targets. A 2-second squeeze from 4 Hispanos spit roughly 90 rounds, each with explosive punch enough to tear up metal, masonry, and men. Pilots refined train busting, aiming at locomotive boilers, where shells punched thin plating and triggered catastrophic steam bursts that paralyzed entire freights. German ground troops learned the sound of the Saber's growl, a giant bumblebee, long before the Typhoon appeared. The warning rarely gave time to hide. Typhoons came in at 300 feet, masking behind hedges and folds in the land until seconds before their run. Radio traffic captured frantic German calls about Jabos and then Tiefflieger, low flyers that hit and were gone before flak could settle aim. By June 1943, 18 Typhoon squadrons stretched from Cornwall to Norfolk, the largest single-type commitment in Fighter Command. The aircraft had found its purpose through necessity and pilot ingenuity. But one transformation remained. The deadliest change, the one that would make it a true tank killer, was already in trials. Britain's worst fighter was about to become Germany's nightmare. The 3-inch rocket projectile came from naval research for convoy defense against surfaced U-boats. Each RP-3 measured about 6 feet and 60 pounds, with a solid cordite motor burning for 2 seconds before the projectile coasted ballistically. 2 warheads were available: a 60-pound high explosive or a 25-pound solid armor piercer. The Ministry of Aircraft Production quickly saw the air-to-ground potential. A salvo of 8 equaled the explosive throw weight of a small cruiser's broadside, carried by a single-engine fighter. Trials began at Predonac, Cornwall, in August 1943, on modified Typhoons with 4 rails under each wing. Zero-length launchers threw exhaust clear of the surfaces. On August 13th, test pilot Bill Humble fired the first live rocket, a single shot from 2,000 yards in a 30-degree dive. It worked, but accuracy was mediocre. Trajectory curved with speed, dive angle, and weather. Pilots would need a new kind of gunnery, more instinct and experience than sights. Squadron leader Dennis Gillam received the first operational rocket Typhoons at 184 Squadron in October 1943, tasked with tactics development. They learned quickly that rocket work inverted cannon habits. Strafing liked shallow dives and longer runs. Rockets needed steep angles, 45 degrees or more, to flatten trajectories and boost hit probability. Pull-out height was critical. Too high and penetration fell off. Too low and you flew through your own blast. Gillam set 1,500 feet as the minimum release, about 3 seconds to recover. Initially, the rocket's psychological shock outstripped its physics. German troops had coping routines for artillery and level bombing. Rockets offered no such comfort. They arrived with a terrifying whoosh, panicking even veterans. Near misses from a 60-pound warhead produced overpressure that burst eardrums and damaged organs. Direct hits didn't just kill vehicles, they erased them. Fireballs incinerated everything within 20 yards, leaving wreckage so mangled that recon often couldn't tell what had been there. By January 1944, 6 squadrons had converted to rockets, with training consuming most of their time. The newly formed 2nd Tactical Air Force, built to support the cross-channel invasion, designated Typhoons as primary anti-armor. Intelligence judged German Panzer divisions the gravest threat to any Allied beachhead. Heavy bombers lacked the precision against mobile columns. Cannon fire bounced off glacis plates. The RP-3's armor-piercing head could, in theory, punch about 75 millimeters at good angles, enough to kill any German tank except the heaviest Tigers with hits to turret tops or engine decks. Skeptics doubted fighter pilots could attain the necessary accuracy under fire. Fair concern. Training showed that even seasoned pilots rarely put more than 30% of rockets within 50 yards of stationary targets in ideal conditions. Combat would add smoke, flak, movement, and stress that worsened aim. Yet rockets were the only rapid response answer for mobile battles. Artillery took hours to shift. Heavies couldn't pick friend from foe in fluid fights. The Typhoon offered something new: devastating firepower. Anywhere within 100 miles in 20 minutes of a call. The Normandy invasion began before dawn on June 6, 1944, and Typhoons were airborne, while American paratroopers still fought for Sainte-Mère-Église. 36 Typhoons from 83 Group crossed at first light to suppress guns shelling Utah Beach. Flight Lieutenant John Baldwin led the first run, rolling through scattered cloud at 7,000 feet and diving at 40 degrees onto concrete bunkers 3 miles inland. The rockets hit hard, collapsing reinforced positions that had shrugged off hours of naval shelling. Baldwin's formation spent 96 rockets in 4 minutes, turning a fortified ridge into a cratered moonscape. German flak responded instantly and viciously. Quad 20mm and dreaded 88s dotted the sector. Typhoons working at 2,000 feet were perfect targets. The steep angles needed for accuracy forced pilots through dense fire, where even near misses could be fatal. On June 7th near Caen, Flying Officer Peter Brooker took a direct hit on pullout. His Typhoon disintegrated, scattering wreckage over a wheat field as horrified wingmen watched. By D-Day's end, 2nd Halve had lost 9 Typhoons to flak and had 14 more, so badly damaged they needed depot rebuilds. The tactical problem was obvious within hours. Find German armor in the bocage. Dense hedgerows, sunken lanes, and woodlots hid dispersed panzers perfectly. The Luftwaffe was swept aside, but Wehrmacht commanders compensated with camouflage and disciplined movement. Tanks moved at night, tucked under trees and nets by dawn. From 5,000 feet, Typhoon pilots saw peaceful fields and quiet villages. Flight Lieutenant Pierre Klostermann captured the frustration. They roared over Normandy with the power to erase a Panzer battalion, yet rarely glimpsed a single vehicle. Procedures evolved fast. Forward air controllers, RAF officers embedded with ground units, built radio nets linking frontline troops to orbiting Typhoons. When British or Canadian infantry made contact with armor, controllers sent grid coordinates and target descriptions using preset codes. Responding Typhoons used cab rank tactics. 4 ship sections held in designated stacks at about 10,000 feet until vectored. The system worked when radios cooperated. Too often, equipment failed, leaving pilots circling while tanks fought just miles away. The 12th SS Panzer Division provided the first major clash on June 7th, when its Recce Battalion probed Canadian lines west of Caen. Squadron leader Chris Foxley Norris, leading 8 Typhoons from 198 Squadron on armed Recce, received the call. He spotted a 20-vehicle column on a tree-lined road, engine smoke marking the trail. The attack began from 8,000 feet through light flak. 32 rockets rippled, 8 direct hits, 4 Panzer rifles, and 3 half-tracks immobilized. Survivors scattered into fields. The advance died. These early strikes set the pattern for the Normandy campaign. German armor retained ground-level superiority, Tanks outgunned Allied equivalents and infantry fought hard, but could not move by day without inviting destruction from above. Panzer leaders learned bitterly, concentrate, and Typhoons find you, disperse, and you lose the mass to break Allied lines. The bocage became a killing ground ruled by a fighter once written off. Operation Goodwood, dawn July 18, 1944, was Montgomery's big attempt to break east of Caen. 3 armored divisions, nearly 750 tanks, would punch a narrow corridor, seize Bourget-Bus Ridge, and crack the German line. He promised Eisenhower a decisive blow and delivered one of the war's most intense air-ground displays, with Typhoons crucial in stopping German reserves from gutting the British spearhead. Bombers opened at 5:45, over 2,000 heavies carpeting German positions. Typhoons waited warmed and loaded, anticipating the counterstroke. It came within 2 hours as the 1st SS, 12th SS, and 21st Panzer divisions converged to smash the penetration. Roughly 300 tanks, about 75 Panthers and 30 Tigers, moved to engage. If they reached the fight intact, they could maul the offensive. Wing Commander Charles Green coordinated the Typhoon response from a forward control post, linked directly to 2nd TAF HQ. Intel fused ultra-decrypts and recce, feeding Green updates on Panzer assembly points. At 0820, photos showed 1st SS forming near Sintho, 8 miles south of the breach. 16 Typhoons from 164 and 183 scrambled within 6 minutes and went straight in. Squadron leader John Riley led the first strike. About 40 vehicles dispersed in open farmland with quad flak nests set to defend. The formation split into 4 ships from different bearings, forcing gunners to split their fire. It worked. While flak chased the lead section, trailers dove clean and loosed 64 rockets, bracketing the column. Recon later confirmed 12 vehicles destroyed outright and 8 mobility kills from near misses that wrecked tracks. The hammering continued all day on July 18th. Whenever German armor tried to mass, Typhoons appeared within 30 minutes. The 12th SS suffered worst near Bretteville-sur-Lez, where 24 Typhoons from 181, 182, and 247 hit a Panzer regiment moving in daylight despite warnings. They lost big. 96 rockets in 12 minutes left a 5-mile trail of burning wrecks that blocked the approach road. Reports from German commanders were grim. SS Obersturmbannführer Rudolf von Ribbentrop radioed that his Recce battalion had been annihilated from the air with losses over 60%. General Heinrich Eberbach told Field Marshal Günther von Kluge that concentrated armored movement by day was suicide. Divisions were being shredded piecemeal before they could join battle. Von Kluge's afternoon report to Berlin admitted the crisis. Armor could no longer maneuver within 50 kilometers of the front by daylight. By the evening of July 20th, when Goodwood ended, Typhoons had flown 294 anti-armor sorties and fired over 2,000 rockets. 2nd TAF intelligence collated strike claims and photos, producing a preliminary tally that credited Typhoons with destroying or disabling about 400 German armored vehicles over 3 days. The figure seemed incredible and drew skepticism from ground commanders and rival air branches. But the wreckage strewn across Normandy told a clear story. The armored reserve was broken from above. The 400 tanks claim demanded verification. Post-war doctrine would hinge on real effectiveness. Operational research teams hit the Goodwood battlefields within days, with clipboards, cameras, and strict damage ID methods. Their findings showed both the Typhoon's devastating impact and a big gap between pilot claims and physical evidence, reshaping views of rocket fighters. They catalogued 257 destroyed or abandoned German armored vehicles across the area. Each wreck was examined for signatures. Rockets left big entry holes in thin armor, catastrophic internal blast, and scorched paint patterns. Artillery showed clusters of smaller penetrations, or single large-caliber hits into ammunition. Tank-on-tank left horizontal penetrations through frontal plates. The results were uncomfortable. Of the 257 wrecks, 87 bore definitive rocket damage, about 34%. Artillery accounted for 93, anti-tank guns for 41. The rest were mixed cores or had been scuttled by German crews. Overclaiming came from the nature of air-ground combat. Pilots diving at 300 miles an hour under flak couldn't reliably watch impacts. Smoke, dust, and vegetation hid hit effects. Secondary explosions from ammo or fuel made brew-ups look like rocket kills where rockets might only have torn tracks or cans. Dennis Gillum, now leading 146 Wing, put it bluntly. In the pullout, you see a huge bang where your rockets went and you assume you brewed the target. Only later do you learn half a dozen others hit the same place, or that the Panther was actually a lorry stacked with drums. Every Air Force wrestled with inflated claims driven by adrenaline, short observation windows, and honest misidentification. But OR also validated the Typhoon's strategic effect beyond pure kill counts. Rockets forced armor to disperse, killed traffic flow at bottlenecks, and created monstrous jams when columns converged. The psychological shock was immense. Captured Panzer crews described paralyzing fear at the sound of approaching engines. Commanders kept hatches shut and slowed movement to a crawl, losing awareness and reaction time. Some officers admitted they refused daylight advances after witnessing rocket strikes on neighboring units. The Falaise Pocket in mid-August provided starker proof. As remnants of 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army tried to flee east through a shrinking gap, Typhoons hit the columns for 6 days. The Chambois-Troun Road became an abattoir. Photos from August 21st showed over 500 destroyed vehicles jammed along 7 miles. Allied troops counted thousands of dead horses, abandoned guns, and soldiers who fled on foot after their transports burned. Pilots called the countryside a killing ground. German records largely match British analysis. Panzer Group West lost about 347 tanks and assault guns in July 1944, roughly 1/3 to air attack. The statistic mattered less than the paralysis. German doctrine demanded mass, mobility, and aggressive counterblows. Typhoons negated all three, turning Panzer divisions into dispersed static defenses incapable of decisive strikes. The cab rank system that matured in Normandy was a revolution, close air support as an on-call battery that could hit anywhere in minutes. Simple in concept, complex in coordination. Typhoon 4s orbited at 8,000 to 10,000 feet in designated stacks, in constant radio contact with forward controllers at the front. When targets appeared, controllers used a standard format for grid, type, and friendly positions. Like taxis at a stand, Typhoons dropped in within 5 to 8 minutes. Group Captain Desmond Scott refined the system while commanding 123 Wing in August 1944. He saw radio wasn't enough. Pilots needed instant visual identification in terrain where friend and foe were often a few hundred yards apart. He implemented smoke marking. Artillery put red phosphorus on enemy and yellow on friendly front lines immediately before attacks. Diving pilots oriented off the smoke, slashing friendly fire risk that had haunted earlier chaos. The forward controllers, barely 40 RAF regiment officers for the entire 2nd TAF, worked from armored vehicles crammed with radios, often alongside tank spearheads. Flight Lieutenant Donald Hetherington earned the Military Cross near Falaise after 12 hours under German shelling, while continuously directing Typhoon strikes against counterattacking armor. He guided 18 missions in a day, adjusting coordinates as the fluid fight shifted. The system was decisive again during the battle for Hill 112 in late June. The British 43rd Division seized the key high ground southwest of Caen, then endured ferocious counterattacks from 9th and 10th SS Panzer. Captain Jimmy Ray, the forward controller with the division, was calling Typhoon strikes every 20 to 30 minutes on June 29th as armor surged up the slopes. He kept cab ranks cycling in, often hitting targets within 400 yards of British foxholes. The strikes broke attacks before momentum could build, letting exhausted infantry hold ground they couldn't have kept by fire and movement alone. German countermeasures evolved with the threat. Panzer commanders moved in morning fog that cut visibility below the attack minimums. They dispersed vehicles singly instead of in columns, accepting poor comms to limit vulnerability. Some tried deception, parking wrecks in the open to draw rocket salvos while combat-ready tanks hid. These tricks bought moments, but couldn't change the core truth. German ground forces in France were under constant eyes and could not mass or move freely by day without swift retribution. The numbers by September 1944 were stark. Second TAF records show about 83% of Typhoon sorties in Normandy flew as cab ranks rather than pre-planned strikes. Average time from target call to weapons on target fell from roughly 90 minutes in June to under 15 by August. Ground commanders trusted the system so completely that they wrote cab rank availability into attack plans. British and Canadian units would deliberately push along routes that exposed German strongpoints, knowing Typhoons could suppress faster than conventional artillery. The Germans coined a bitter term, Jabofrei, brief windows when weather or darkness freed them from fighter bombers. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, wounded by a Typhoon attack on July 17th, had warned Berlin that Allied air supremacy made mobile warfare impossible. He was right. Cab rank didn't just support the ground fight, it changed it, rendering German operational doctrine obsolete in the West. The Typhoon pilots' war demanded a special courage, not the split-second reflex bravado of dogfights, but the cold resolve to keep flying into places where death came without warning and with no time to jink. At 2,000 feet, every German weapon could reach you, from rifle-caliber machine guns to the dreaded 88. Unlike bomber crews at altitude, who could at least see bursts and weave, Typhoon pilots had to hold the dive, breaking off wasted ordnance and risked everything for nothing. The losses were grim. In June and July 1944 alone, 2nd TAU lost 151 Typhoons to ground fire, over 2 aircraft per day in the peak. Another 247 came home shot up, patch jobs to total engine swaps. Pilot casualties reached 23% across 8 weeks. A standard 50-sortie tour meant better than 1 in 5 odds of being killed or seriously wounded. Loss rates exceeded RAF bomber commands in the same period, but drew less public notice because tactical strikes lacked the spectacle of 1,000 bomber raids. Pierre Klosterman wrote of low-level terror, screaming down at 400, tracer seeming to float, then whip past like luminous whips, seeing individual gunners tracking your canopy. Then the world becomes orange tracer and black puffs, and you hold the dive because breaking off makes it all pointless. The psychological toll mounted. Volunteers began to dread briefings, knowing today might be the day a lucky gunner put a 20mm through the cockpit. The German 88 was especially lethal. A 21-pound shell at roughly 2,690 feet per second, fast enough to beat any reaction. Doctrine placed them in overlapping belts along likely approach lanes, making kill zones where multiple guns spoke at once. A direct hit didn't damage a Typhoon, it erased it. Squadron leader Derek Walker watched his wingman, flying officer Colin Mackay, take an 88 near Argenton. His report: Mackay's aircraft exploded. No parachute, nothing could have survived. Experience didn't grant immunity. John Baldwin, the pioneer of rocket tactics, died July 19th after flying through his own rocket blast pattern. Shrapnel, severed oil lines, and ignited vapor. He clawed to 1,500 feet, but the canopy had warped and jammed. Witnesses saw him struggling before the Typhoon rolled, inverted, and fell into forest. Wing Commander John Riley, over 180 sorties, was shot down 3 times and returned each time after weeks of recovery. Dark humor helped crews cope. Squadrons ran grim betting pools on who would go down first each month. Nose art grew macabre. Skulls, coffins, guillotines, mocking risk by over-owning it. Messes drank hard, part tradition, part anesthesia for nerves, shredded by missions where friends vanished without a trace. Commanders watched for cracks, hesitation in briefings, repeated instructions needed, hands shaking over the authorization book. Those men were quietly reassigned, nerves gone. Yet the force kept flying, replacements learned in days. Be aggressive, release within parameters no matter the flak. Trust your wingman to keep guns down while you aim. The Typhoon arm fought on through determination and institutional insistence that ground attack was as vital as bombing or air defense. The price in young lives bought real movement on the map. German armies pushed east, harried every mile by rockets screaming out of summer skies. The Hawker Typhoon's journey, from catastrophe to indispensability, mirrored Britain's wider war. Adapt under pressure, swap rigid doctrine for pragmatic fixes, persist with flawed tools until they work. No aircraft illustrated it better than a machine that began by killing its own and ended by reshaping ground war. From September 1941's disasters to August 1944's Falaise carnage, the story was not merely technical improvement, but a complete rethink of what the Typhoon could do. The ledger at the end was stark beyond disputed tank claims. From D-Day to May 1945, Typhoon squadrons flew over 36,000 combat sorties, fired roughly 60,000 rockets, and expended about 150 million rounds of cannon ammo. They destroyed or damaged thousands of vehicles, locomotives, bridges, and strong points across France, the Low Countries, and into Germany. More importantly, they imposed operational paralysis, denying German commanders the maneuver freedom their doctrine required. In 1944, by daylight in the west, Wehrmacht ground forces were pinned, reduced to static defense. Allied material could grind down. Victory still came at a heavy human cost. The RAF lost 672 Typhoons to all causes in the war's last 2 years, about 1/3 of production. More than 1,000 pilots were killed or missing, hundreds more badly wounded. These losses rarely made headlines. They came not from glamorous dogfights, but from relentless strikes against ground targets, each run a roulette of invisible gunners in hedgerows and barns. The Typhoon arm received less fame than Bomber Command or the Battle of Britain's fighter aces. Yet its contribution to liberation was equal. Post-war analysis vindicated the hard choice to keep the program alive through 1942's darkest months. Air Marshal Arthur Tedder, later Eisenhower's deputy, wrote that tactical air supremacy shortened the war by months, perhaps years, crediting the Typhoon with making large-scale German armored counterblows impossible after Normandy. Whenever Wehrmacht leaders tried to mass panzers for a decisive strike, rocket-armed fighters shredded them before deployment. The calculus was brutal but clear. Better to lose pilots in their 20s than prolong a war that would take thousands more lives across all services. The legacy reached beyond numbers and operations. The Typhoon proved that air power could shape ground combat directly and immediately, not just through the indirect effects of strategic bombing. That insight shaped NATO doctrine. Dedicated close air support aircraft and sophisticated forward control systems trace their lineage to cab rank over Normandy. Modern aviation's focus on precision CAS and tight land-air integration grew from lessons bought with Typhoon pilots' lives over French fields. Individual stories put faces to the data. Roland Beaumont survived with 2 DSOs and multiple DFCs, became Hawker's chief test pilot, and later flew through the sound barrier in Britain's first supersonic aircraft. Pierre Clostermann, the French ace who wrote so vividly, finished with 33 victories and flew until age 74. Desmond Scott, the New Zealander who perfected cab rank, retired as Air Commodore after commanding RAF Germany. For every famed survivor, dozens rest in Commonwealth war cemeteries, remembered in squadron books and fading photographs. The Typhoon itself became obsolete almost overnight. Meteors and jets made piston fighters antiques within months of VE Day. The last operational squadron disbanded in 1946. Airframes were scrapped or sold abroad for pennies. Few survived. Today, only a handful sit in museums, fabric and metal witnesses to the desperate improvisation of Britain's hardest years. They tell a remarkable tale. A fighter so flawed it nearly died, yet so vital it helped break Hitler's armies, proof that even catastrophic failures can be redeemed by courage, ingenuity, and blood. The Typhoon's redemption came at terrible cost. But it came, etched into Norman earth with rockets and resolve, turning Britain's worst fighter into exactly the weapon the war required when it mattered most.